Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. Here, we tell strange and forgotten stories from the past in a quiet voice made to help you relax or fall asleep before we begin. If you enjoy this kind of calm storytelling, feel free to subscribe. It helps the channel grow and brings more sleepy tales your way. Also, I'd love to know what time are you watching this. Leave a comment below and tell me, is it late at night or early in the morning? Now, close your eyes if you like. Let the world slow down and let's begin tonight's mystery. A man in a suit. It was the morning of November 24th, 1971. A Wednesday, cool and overcast in Portland, Oregon. The airport buzzed with travelers eager to reach family before Thanksgiving. Some moved quickly with briefcases, others with children, tugging on sleeves, and some simply waited, staring through tall airport windows into the gray sky. Among them stood a man who, at first glance, didn't stand out. He wore a dark suit, black or navy, accounts differ, a neatly pressed white shirt, a skinny black tie, and polished loafers. In one hand, a briefcase. In the other, a folded raincoat. He looked to be in his mid-40s, maybe older. Thin lips, a narrow nose, calm eyes behind a pair of dark sunglasses, the kind worn not for style, but for subtlety. He purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle from the Northwest Orient counter. Flight 305. No luggage checked in. He paid in cash $20. Name on the ticket, Dan Cooper. Not David, not Daniel, just Dan. The flight was short, only about 30 minutes in the air. A simple commuter flight, the type taken every day by business people, students, families. Dan Cooper passed through security, which in 1971 was brief. No body scans, no pat-downs, no metal detectors as we know them now. Just a glance, a nod, and he was through. At the gate, he waited silently, like dozens of others. He didn't pace. He didn't read. He simply sat. When boarding began, he stepped forward calmly, presented his ticket, and walked aboard. Flight 305 was a Boeing 727, the kind of aircraft with a unique rear stairway that lowered beneath the tail. Cooper took seat 18C on the right side of the plane, near the rear, 3 rows from the back. He placed his briefcase carefully beside him. The cabin filled with passengers, 36 in total, plus 6 crew members. The air was warm with recycled air and the scent of cologne, cigarette smoke, and fresh clothing. Dan Cooper reached for the safety card in the seat pocket and studied it. Some say he flipped through it slowly, as though double-checking something. Others remember him gazing out the window for a long time, watching the ground crew prepare. A flight attendant approached. Her name was Florence Schaffner, early 20s. Confident kind. He looked up, smiled politely, and ordered a drink, bourbon and soda. As the engines began to whine and the plane taxied out, Cooper sat quietly. He sipped his drink, crossed his legs. He seemed relaxed, not agitated, not nervous. In fact, most who later recalled that flight said he seemed like the most ordinary man aboard, and maybe he was. Or maybe he was something else entirely, because beneath that neatly combed hair and those dark sunglasses was the man who, within an hour, would become one of the most famous criminals in American history. But for now, he was just a man in a suit, a man sitting quietly, watching clouds pass by and planning something that no one would ever forget. The note, everything seemed normal in the air. Flight 305 from Portland to Seattle was short, routine, and peaceful. The route was just over 170 miles, about 30 minutes in the air. The cabin hummed quietly. Passengers chatted, read newspapers. or drifted into light naps. Outside the windows, gray clouds passed slowly, pierced by pale winter sunlight. No one expected that aviation history was about to take a sharp turn. A T1 point. Florence Schaffner, the flight attendant, was walking past Cooper again. He seemed calm, but when he saw her, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and handed her a small slip of paper. Florence accepted it without much thought. She was used to passengers handing her phone numbers, jokes, notes. She tucked it into her uniform pocket and began to walk away, but Cooper gently leaned toward her and spoke in a very calm, controlled tone. "Miss, you'd better read that note." "I have a bomb." Florence stopped. She turned back, and she felt her heartbeat quicken. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the note, and read it. The message was brief, written in clear block letters. "I have a bomb. I want you to sit next." To me, surprised, but maintaining professionalism, Florence sat beside Cooper, who then opened the briefcase resting on his lap. Inside were rows of red cylinders, wired together and connected to a battery. Everything looked very real. Florence wasn't an explosives expert, but what she saw left no doubt. If it wasn't a real bomb, it certainly looked like one. "Please, don't cause a scene," Cooper said calmly. "Everything will be fine if you follow my instructions." And then he made his demands. He wanted $200,000 in cash, in $20 bills, for parachutes, a fuel truck ready to refuel the aircraft immediately upon landing in Seattle. Florence asked if she could relay the message to the captain. Cooper nodded. "Stay calm," he added. "I don't want to hurt anyone." Captain William Scott was informed. He remained composed and quickly contacted air traffic control, who then reached out to the FBI. On board, no one except the crew knew anything was wrong. Cooper was composed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't act erratically. In fact, he was almost polite. Following his request, Florence stayed seated beside him. She brought him another drink, which he sipped slowly. During that time, the captain, in coordination with the FBI and aviation authorities, continued flying toward Seattle. The plane circled the city for nearly 2 hours, waiting while the ransom money, parachutes, and fuel were gathered. Cooper showed no impatience. He simply waited. At one point, he even drank coffee. He maintained total control of the situation, but never behaved like someone trying to instill fear. Florence remembered his voice as calm, almost hypnotic. She felt like she was speaking with someone intelligent, composed, confident. And despite the danger, she didn't feel panicked. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He wanted something, and it was clear. He had a plan. At his request, the cabin lights were dimmed. Everything happened in a hush of breath and the steady hum of the engines. Outside, dusk was falling. Passengers still knew nothing. To them, it was a quiet, perhaps slightly delayed flight. Meanwhile, on the ground, the FBI was assembling the ransom, with help from local banks. Each bill was to be photographed, serial numbers recorded. Authorities knew the money might be the only way to trace the hijacker. The parachutes, too, were carefully selected, 2 main chutes and 2 reserves. They had to look authentic, unused, and unaltered. Everything had to look as if no one was trying to outsmart Cooper. The FBI understood that the key was not to provoke him into doing anything rash. He was still a man with a potential bomb. In an airplane, high above the ground. And the only thing keeping him calm was the belief that he was in control, and he was a master of control. The clock neared 5:30 p.m. outside. The world below grew darker by the minute. A cold November rain painted streaks across the aircraft's windows. Somewhere in the haze, The lights of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport began to shimmer in the distance. Cooper had given strict instructions. The moment they landed, the aircraft was not to taxi to the terminal. Instead, it would stop in a remote section of the tarmac, far from the public eye, away from crowds. No snipers, no police, no games. The crew relayed these demands to the control tower, and they were honored. The airport's ground crew, acting under instruction, guided Flight 305 to a quiet corner. There, waiting in the wet shadows, was an unmarked van with the money and parachutes. Another truck, filled with jet fuel, idled nearby. The passengers, still blissfully unaware of the crisis, sat waiting. Some dozed. Some chatted quietly. A few were annoyed at the delay. None of them suspected that a man on board had threatened the lives of everyone on that plane. Once everything was in position, the crew began the passenger deplaning process. Cooper allowed it, provided it was done slowly and quietly. One by one, passengers walked down the aircraft stairs and into waiting shuttle vehicles. As they exited, they left behind the mystery. All that remained on board was Cooper, a few flight attendants, the pilot and co-pilot. Florence Schaffner stepped off soon after, replaced by another flight attendant who would remain with the crew. Cooper kept the briefcase close at all times. He never raised his voice, never threatened, and never wavered. The FBI had assembled $200,000 in $20 bills. The stacks of cash were bundled and placed into a standard-issue backpack. Cooper briefly checked the money. He didn't count every bill, just scanned to ensure it looked complete. He was satisfied the parachutes had also arrived. 2 primary chutes and 2 reserves. He selected one of each and set the others aside. The exact reasoning behind his selection remains unknown, but he did not appear to inspect them carefully. Then came the refueling. Cooper insisted on no movement, no suspicious activity. The process took longer than expected due to heavy rain and a few miscommunications between crews. Still, Cooper remained patient. He even offered to pay for a second round of drinks for the crew, though this was politely declined. While waiting, he chatted with one of the remaining flight attendants. Not about the hijacking, but about mundane things. The weather, the view. He asked about her job, her travel experiences. Again, he remained calm and strangely courteous. At one point, he looked out the window, watching the fuel truck roll away. Then he turned back and spoke clearly. Let's fly south. And with that, the plan moved into its final stage. He outlined very specific flight instructions to the captain. Heading southward toward Mexico City altitude. No higher than 10,000 feet airspeed. No faster than 200 knots landing gear. Down. Flaps set at 15 degrees cabin pressure. Left unpressurized most notably. He instructed that the rear staircase remain unlocked, a command rarely, if ever, given by a passenger. The captain acknowledged, and the plane prepared for departure. By now, night had fully fallen. The tarmac shimmered with rain. Lights reflected off puddles like stars on asphalt. At 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 lifted off again, this time with a new course, and with one fewer certainty. As the wheels of Flight 305 lifted from the rain-slicked tarmac, the cabin dimmed into near darkness. Only a few cabin lights remained lit, and the silence among the small group left on board was profound. There were no more passengers, only D.B. Cooper, the pilots, and 2 remaining flight attendants. Outside, the sky was an ink-black sheet, dotted with faint glimmers of distant stars, and lit from beneath by occasional lightning in the distance. The mood inside the plane was one of tense quiet. Everyone had a role, and everyone played it calmly. But one could sense the awareness they were part of something unlike anything they'd ever experienced. Cooper sat near the rear of the aircraft, the briefcase and the ransom money beside him. One of the flight attendants noted that he seemed even calmer now than earlier. He was focused, composed, almost meditative. Occasionally he would glance toward the rear stair system. Assessing it, the Boeing 727 was an unusual aircraft in that its rear staircase could be lowered during flight, a rare and risky feature that Cooper had clearly planned to use. No one knew when he would do it. He offered no specific timeline. He just watched, waited, calculated. Outside, the aircraft entered rougher skies. Turbulence rocked the cabin gently. Wind howled just beyond the aluminum walls. Somewhere below them stretched hundreds of square miles of forested terrain, the vast wilderness of southern Washington. Cooper instructed one of the flight attendants to retreat to the cockpit and remain there. He wanted to be alone in the rear. She obeyed. He gathered the cash and placed it in a canvas bag. He fastened the parachute with what looked like practiced hands. Everything he did was methodical, unhurried, intentional. He tied the canvas bag to himself using a length of rope. Once secured, he moved toward the rear stairway. No1 on the flight deck saw what happened next. They only heard it, a sudden whoosh of air pressure, the warning light indicating the stairway had been deployed. The crew asked over the intercom if Cooper was all right. No response. Moments later, they felt a sharp shift in the aircraft's balance, a slight upward jerk, as if a weight had been released. Then, nothing. Silence. The aircraft continued southward, but its shadow no longer held Cooper within it. He had jumped somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Into the storm, into the night, into history. Back in the cockpit, the crew remained composed. The pilot kept the plane steady and on course, eventually diverting to Reno, Nevada for landing. Once on the ground, agents swarmed the aircraft. They found the cabin empty. The rear stairway had indeed been deployed mid-flight. One parachute remained. The rest gone, and so was DB. Cooper, the man who had threatened with a bomb, collected his ransom, ordered a second takeoff, and vanished into the wind. No1 had seen him jump. No radar had tracked his descent. No one knew where he had landed. No1 knew if he had survived. The moment Flight 305 landed in Reno, the investigation began. Federal agents, local police, airport security, and FBI specialists boarded the aircraft carefully, stepping over damp carpets and noting every detail. The rear stair was still partially lowered. Rain had blown in through the open tail, soaking the final few rows of seats. It was eerie. The ghost of Cooper's presence still lingered in the stale air. They photographed every seat, every tray, every fingerprint. They collected cigarette butts from Cooper's armrest. They dusted for prints on the briefcase handle that had been left behind, but empty. The bomb, or what appeared to be one, was gone with him. Back in Seattle, the passengers were interviewed one by one. Most of them had no idea anything unusual had even happened. A few had noticed Cooper's calm demeanor, his sunglasses, the bourbon he sipped without urgency. None saw him do anything remotely suspicious. And out in the wilderness, the vast, damp forests of Washington and Oregon, the real search began. The terrain below Cooper's suspected jump zone was unforgiving. Dense evergreen forests, steep ridges, swollen rivers, snow-covered hillsides, wind, fog, cold. Search teams combed the area on foot, in helicopters, with dogs, and with infrared cameras. They scoured roads, logging trails, abandoned cabins. Every lead, every report of a strange sound or a light in the woods was investigated, but there was nothing. And no parachute, no footprints, no torn clothing, no bag of money, nothing. Days turned 2 weeks. The search expanded, then contracted. Hope faded. Theories began to grow in the silence. Could he have survived? Possibly. But experts were skeptical. Jumping from a commercial airliner into stormy night skies with limited visibility, freezing winds, and unknown terrain was no small feat. And yet, there was no evidence of a body. So perhaps he did survive. Perhaps he landed safely, buried the parachute, and slipped away into the wilderness unseen. The media swarmed. Newspapers called him the gentleman hijacker. Some praised his calmness. Others saw him as reckless. But one thing was certain: the name, D.B. Cooper, was now etched into history. Interestingly, D.B. was a media mistake. The hijacker had identified himself as Dan Cooper, a reporter, confusing him with an unrelated. Suspect early in the investigation accidentally published D.B. and the name stuck. In the weeks that followed, over 800 suspects were investigated. Veterans, prison escapees, bank robbers, airline workers, anyone with parachute experience and a missing timeline, but the evidence was thin. No one matched everything. Even the serial numbers on the ransom cash logged meticulously by the FBI yielded nothing. Not a single bill showed up in circulation until 9 years later. But that is for another chapter. It was February 1980. Nearly a decade had passed since that stormy night when D.B. Cooper vanished into the darkness. For most, the mystery had faded into a quiet legend, a story passed around during late-night conversations or speculative documentaries. But then something surfaced. A family was camping along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. The weather was cool, but the sun was out, and the riverbank was scattered with driftwood and sand. A young boy named Brian Ingram, just 8 years old, was digging in the sand with a plastic shovel near the shoreline, and that's when he saw it, worn, dirty, buried beneath the surface, a bundle of cash. His parents called the police. The FBI responded quickly. They extracted 3 packets of money, tightly bundled, but damaged by time and weather. When examined, they revealed a total of $5,800, all in $20 bills, and then came the real shock. The serial numbers matched. The ransom given to D.B. Cooper in 1971 after nearly 10 years. A trace had finally reappeared. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. How did the money get there? Did Cooper bury it? Did it wash down from the mountains through river channels? Had he dropped it accidentally while escaping? The location complicated things. The find site was not directly in the flight path. It was miles from the suspected jump zone. Some investigators theorized that the money was a decoy, perhaps left deliberately by Cooper to confuse search efforts. Others believed it was lost during his landing or floated downstream after he died in the woods. And no other traces were ever found nearby. No body, no parachute, no personal items, just the bills, silent, eroded by time, but still whispering his name. The bundles were examined extensively. Scientists studied the decay patterns. Sand was analyzed. Forensic geologists traced the soil composition, but no definitive answers came. The boy was allowed to keep a portion of the money as a curiosity. The rest remained in FBI custody. For the public, the case reawakened. News outlets ran fresh headlines. D.B. Cooper money found. New clues in old skyjacking, but for all the excitement, the trail quickly went cold again. There were no new suspects, no fresh evidence, just one reminder that the mystery still lived beneath the surface, quite literally. It was a strange echo, a ghostly touch from the past. And then, just like that, silence again. With time passing and no new physical evidence, the question shifted from where did he go to who was he? D.B. Cooper, or more accurately, Dan Cooper, remained an enigma. Law enforcement tried to build a profile based on everything they had: his behavior, his voice, his choices, and what little he left behind. He was calm, deliberate, polite. He never once raised his voice or showed panic. He drank alcohol, but didn't seem intoxicated. He made no threats beyond what was necessary, and he harmed no one. This wasn't the profile of a violent criminal or a reckless thrill-seeker. The FBI began to focus on military experience, the parachute knowledge, the calm under pressure, the familiarity with the Boeing 727. Many believed he was ex-military, possibly with a background in special operations or paratrooper units. Then came the other details. His choice of alias, Dan Cooper, a name that turned out to belong to a French-Canadian comic book hero, a fictional test pilot who embarked on daring adventures. These comics were never sold in the U.S., but they were popular in Europe and Canada. Did Cooper have a connection there? Had he read them as a child? Was the name a clue or a joke? His suit and tie were unremarkable, but he had a clip-on tie, something worn more often by working-class men than businessmen. His black shoes were practical, not fashionable. He smoked Raleigh cigarettes, a brand often used by people who saved the coupons for rebates. Each of these details was examined, debated, dissected. Suspect profiles were created. Hundreds of men were interviewed. Former paratroopers, criminals, airline employees, people who had once boasted drunkenly in bars or had gaps in their timelines. Some suspects were compelling. One man had a history of parachuting, a criminal background, and resembled the composite sketch. Another had worked for an airline and suddenly paid off debt around the time of the hijacking, but none of them fit perfectly. Fingerprint comparisons came back negative. Alibis, though weak, couldn't be disproved. No DNA had been collected in 1971. The case remained a web of maybes. The legend grew with every year. For some, D.B. Cooper became a symbol of rebellion, the man who beat the system. For others, he was a ghost, a trickster, a mystery too perfect to ever solve. And all the while, investigators returned again and again to those 30 minutes in the sky. How did he remain so calm? Why choose that specific plane? Why that route? That time of year? And perhaps most haunting of all, what happened after the jump? Some imagined him landing in a clearing, laughing, walking off into the trees. Others pictured a tragic fall, the parachute failing, his story ending in silence beneath the forest canopy, but without a body, without conclusive evidence. The mind is free to wander, to imagine, to dream, and that's what keeps this story alive. With the passing years, the mystery of D.B. Cooper took on a life of its own. As the trail grew colder, the story grew richer. Not in evidence, but in speculation, rumor, and mythology. The comic book connection remained one of the most curious threads. The French-Canadian pilot, Dan Cooper, flew fictional missions full of espionage and danger. Could it have been a childhood fantasy that Cooper brought to life? Or a calculated symbol meant to taunt authorities? Perhaps the name was chosen purely at random. But in mysteries like these, random never feels like enough. Then there was the tie, a black JC. penny clip-on tie that Cooper left behind on his seat before he jumped. Years later, FBI investigators would re-examine it using modern forensic methods. Tiny particles were found embedded in the fabric. Rare earth elements like cerium and strontium sulfide, typically associated with aerospace engineering. This reignited theories that Cooper may have worked in a highly technical field, possibly even in aircraft manufacturing. The Boeing 727 itself became an object of fascination. Cooper had selected this specific plane, and for good reason. It had an aft stair that could be lowered during flight, an unusual and useful feature. Only someone with inside knowledge would have known about it. Most commercial passengers, even frequent flyers, had no clue such a feature existed. Even more curious, Cooper requested the plane fly below 10,000 feet at a speed of around 200 knots. That ensured the conditions would be suitable for a parachute jump. It also made the plane easier to handle during a low-altitude descent. His instructions were precise, military precise. Some theorized he had tested this method before, that he had trained under similar conditions. Others believed he might have practiced the jump in secret locations or even in a military training environment. But no training log, no base record, no deployment matched his description. And then there was the question of his silence. If Cooper survived, why didn't he ever come forward? Why didn't he spend the money? Why not even a hint, a clue, a letter? Some believed he had died shortly after the jump. Injured, lost, cold and alone in the forest. Others believed the opposite, that Cooper had landed cleanly, shed his clothes, changed identities, and melted into the world that he never wanted. Attention. That he never needed the money, only the experience. A man who stole a fortune, just to disappear. Authors, amateur sleuths, podcasters, and TV specials all tried to connect dots across decades. From CIA connections to secret twin identities. From disgruntled airline workers to radical political fugitives. Some theories were wild. Others were chillingly possible, but none were proven. DB. Cooper became less of a man and more of an idea. An unanswered question whispered between two worlds. What is freedom really? Is it vanishing without a trace? Is it beating the system with a briefcase and a parachute? Or is it becoming a legend simply by leaving the last page blank? As the years drifted by, the mystery surrounding DB Cooper evolved from a federal case to a cultural phenomenon. No longer confined to FBI files or detective boards, Cooper's story spread across bookshelves, classrooms, living rooms, and digital forums. The man who vanished with $200,000 had, in a strange twist of fate, become immortal. By the 1990s, DB Cooper was more than just a name. He was a folk hero, a modern outlaw in the mold of Robin Hood or Jesse James, except that unlike them, he hurt no one, fired no gun, and vanished without a trace. He had style, calmness, and mystique, and most of all, he had silence on his side. He became a symbol of rebellion, not through violence, but through mystery. A man who challenged the system with intellect and precision, then disappeared into legend. His image began appearing on T-shirts, posters, mugs. Indie bands wrote songs about him. Comedians referenced him. He made cameos in TV shows and films, usually portrayed as clever, cool, and enigmatic. Every November 24th, especially around the Pacific Northwest, armchair detectives, historians, and Cooper enthusiasts would gather online or in person. They would host discussions, reenactments, and even skydiving stunts in tribute. The FBI still officially investigated tips, But it had long become clear that the case had moved beyond law enforcement. It now lived in the realm of cultural folklore. That shift changed the way people talked about him. In schools, he became part of history lessons about the 1970s. In literature, he was cited in essays about identity, myth, and freedom. On podcasts, he was analyzed not only as a suspect, but as a symbol. What did D.B. Cooper really represent? To some, he was the ultimate anti-hero, cool under pressure, exacting in his plans, and gone without harming a soul. To others, he was a puzzle, a cipher, a blank canvas onto which we projected our own hopes and frustrations. And perhaps that's why the legend endured. Because in a world that's constantly observed, analyzed, and documented, D.B. Cooper represents the great unknown, the possibility that one person can outsmart the system, walk away, and never be caught. That freedom, in its purest form, might still exist even if only in myth. In the silence he left behind, we hear echoes of something. We rarely touch the unexplained. That silence became a canvas, and we've painted it ever since. By the early 2000s, the D.B. Cooper case had become a permanent fixture in the landscape of American mystery. Despite decades without resolution, the case continued to inspire new theories, new suspects, and new debates often as intense as. They were imaginative. One theory suggested that Cooper was an insider, someone who worked within the airline industry. This theory drew on his detailed knowledge of the Boeing 727, including the rear stair mechanism and ideal flight conditions for a jump. Some pointed to former employees with military backgrounds, citing their understanding of airspeed, altitude, and pressure systems. Another theory revolved around the idea that Cooper didn't survive the jump. Skeptics argued that parachuting into the stormy wilderness at night, with bulky cash tied to his body and minimal visibility, was essentially a death sentence. They believed his body may have landed in an inaccessible ravine, swept away by a river or buried by snow, but supporters of the survival theory pointed to his calm demeanor and preparation. He wasn't panicked. He asked for specific parachutes. He gave instructions like a man who had planned every step. If he died, they argued, why wasn't a single trace ever found? One compelling suspect was Richard McCoy Jr.B., a former Green Beret, who hijacked a plane in a nearly identical fashion months after Cooper's jump. McCoy used a parachute, demanded a ransom, and jumped from the rear of a plane. He was later caught, escaped prison, and was killed in a shootout with the FBI. Many believed he fit the profile perfectly. Yet DNA and fingerprints did not match. Another theory pointed to a man named Kenneth Christensen, a former paratrooper and flight attendant for Northwest Orient. He had military experience, a resemblance to the sketch, and suspicious financial behavior after 1971. His family believed he had confessed in vague terms before his death. But again, evidence was circumstantial. Some went further into conspiracy territory. They suggested Cooper had ties to intelligence agencies, that his escape was covered up for political reasons. Others claimed he was a decoy for a larger criminal operation. A few even suggested he never jumped at all, that he hid on the plane and slipped away unnoticed. And then there were the more poetic ideas that D.B. Cooper had simply wanted to vanish, not for money or revenge, but to escape, to disappear cleanly from a life he no longer wanted. These theories revealed more than just a desire to solve a crime. They showed our hunger to understand what we cannot prove, and perhaps in Cooper's case, that hunger is the point. Because maybe he never wanted to be found. Maybe the best ending is no ending at all. In 2011, nearly 40 years after the infamous jump, the FBI publicly acknowledged what many already suspected. The trail had gone cold, despite one of the longest and most exhaustive investigations in the Bureau's history. No conclusive evidence had emerged. Hundreds of suspects, thousands of hours, dozens of tips every year, and still nothing. The case remained open, but the team assigned to it had been gradually reduced. The once sprawling operation was now little more than a file drawer and a phone line reserved for the rare, promising tip. In 2016, the FBI made the difficult decision to officially close the active investigation. The news made headlines. FBI closes book on DB. Cooper, the agency cited the need to reallocate resources to higher priority threats. But to many, it felt like the end of an era. The closing of a chapter that never truly opened, yet even in its closure, the case breathed with quiet persistence. Online forums still buzzed. New theories emerged monthly. Amateur detectives tracked down elderly men who fit the profile, analyzed maps, scanned riverbanks, and recreated the flight path with satellite data and wind models. The mystery had outlived its file folder. It had become self-sustaining. At FBI headquarters, the physical evidence was boxed and archived. The black clip-on tie, cigarette butts, a portion of the recovered money, sketches, notes, and photographs. The evidence room was silent, but charged. With decades of fascination. TV specials still aired regularly. Podcasts picked at every detail. Documentaries revisited the timeline, the science, the sociology. Each one adding just enough to keep the conversation alive. And no other unsolved case captured the balance of boldness and ambiguity quite like this one. DB Cooper didn't just vanish from a plane. He vanished into our collective consciousness. And perhaps that's why the story never fades, because in a world where everything is traced, recorded, and surveilled, the idea that someone could disappear so cleanly feels both impossible and irresistible. And maybe, just maybe, Cooper is still out there. An old man now, quiet, watching and smiling. Imagine for a moment that Cooper did survive, that after leaping from the rear stairway into the cold, chaotic sky, his parachute opened cleanly, that he floated down through sheets of rain, drifted past treetops, and landed softly somewhere deep in the woods. No twisted ankle, no tangled ropes, just the distant hum of the jet growing fainter overhead. He cuts himself free, stashes the chute beneath a fallen log, grabs the bag of money, damp but intact, then walks quietly, confidently, toward a road only he knows. Maybe there's a small cabin nearby. Maybe there's a friend waiting. Maybe there's a buried car hidden weeks earlier. Or maybe he simply disappears into the forest and keeps walking until the trees thin and a quiet town appears on the horizon. The cash remains untouched for months. Then slowly, carefully, it enters circulation. Not in bulk, not in patterns, just here and there. A 20 slipped into a diner, another handed to a gas station clerk, and he becomes someone new. A man with no past, no future. A quiet job, a rented room, a routine. He watches the news coverage, reads the theories, smiles at the sketches. He grows old, lives not lavishly, but simply, never touches the rest of the money, never tells a soul, and when he dies, there is no confession, no grand revelation, just a silence that lasts, because maybe, for Cooper, it was never about wealth. Maybe it was about something else entirely. Control, escape, reinvention, or maybe just maybe it was about seeing if he could do it, if he could plan it, pull it off, and vanish. And if he did, then his silence is the final proof of success. The ultimate vanishing act, not into the sky, but into the idea of freedom itself. Some mysteries fade with time. Memories weaken. Files get buried. Names are forgotten, but not this one, the story of DB. Cooper has become more than a case. It is now a part of American folklore. The details, strange and perfect, resist closure. The unanswered questions act like open windows. We can't help but look through them, hoping to glimpse a truth beyond. It's a story that doesn't end because no one truly wants it to. Every few years, a new tip surfaces. A deathbed confession. A suspicious diary. An old parachute found buried beneath pine needles. They spark a wave of renewed interest: articles, interviews, reenactments. And then silence returns, as if the mystery breathes. Inhale, exhale, yet the facts remain the same. A man, dressed sharply and speaking politely, hijacked a plane. He received his ransom. He jumped into a storm, and he disappeared. No one was killed. No shots were fired. No demands beyond the essentials were made. It was elegant, terrifying in theory, but strangely respectful in execution. That balance between danger and dignity is what captivates. Cooper didn't act like a villain. He was courteous. He said, "Please and thank you." He was calm, measured, every move calculated. He spoke softly, like a man who had nothing to prove, and perhaps that's why people still wonder. Not just who he was, but why he did it. Was he escaping justice? Escaping routine? Escaping the expectations placed upon him by a world he no longer trusted? Or was he seeking something pure? One chance to vanish cleanly, to shed an identity and begin again. Not for wealth or fame, but for freedom. In a time before mass surveillance, Cooper's escape marked the end of an era, the last breath of a world where vanishing was still possible. He represents what's now impossible: a man with no phone, no social media, no digital shadow, only silence. And in that silence, we project everything we want him to be. He is clever because he fooled the system. He is brave because he jumped. He is kind because he spared lives. He is no one. He is everyone, and maybe that's the real reason the story endures. Not because we want answers, but because we want the question to remain open. So that late at night, when the wind howls past our windows, we can still ask, what if I had done it? What if I had disappeared? What if freedom really means never being found? And then we smile, because DB Cooper, whoever he was, gave us that thought, a mystery we carry like a soft secret, not to solve, but to keep. Now, as we bring this quiet journey to a close, you can let go of the questions, the names, the theories, the maps, the endless wondering. Let your breath slow. Let the weight of the day slip away. You've listened to the mystery. You've walked beside a man in a dark suit, carrying a briefcase into the clouds. You followed the story through forests, across rivers, and into the corners of memory and myth. And now, there's nothing more to figure out. Not tonight. Tonight is for stillness. Let your thoughts drift like Cooper did, light, floating downward, through the wind, carried gently by the unknown. There's a quiet freedom in not knowing, a comfort in the open-ending. In the hush of the cabin, in the flicker of a city far below, in the steady rhythm of your breath. Tonight, the sky is dark but peaceful. The storm has passed. The questions can wait. Sleep now. You are safe. You are at peace. And somewhere out there in the soft night, a legend sleeps too. Good night. Sweet dreams.